The crack of a gunshot echoed through the vast Montana territory as Preston Finch ducked behind a boulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. The year was 1878, and the untamed wilderness of the American frontier was as beautiful as it was deadly. Preston had seen his fair share of troubles since leaving his family's farm in Missouri 3 years ago, but nothing quite like the spectacle unfolding before him now. A weathered wagon sat abandoned in a small clearing ahead, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the autumn breeze. What had caught Preston's attention wasn't the wagon itself, but the muffled sounds coming from within, sounds distinctly human and distinctly distressed. Preston adjusted his worn leather hat and peered cautiously around the boulder. The men who had been guarding the wagon were now riding away, dust clouds rising behind their horses as they disappeared into the distance. He counted 4 riders, all moving with haste as if they couldn't leave fast enough. His hand rested on the handle of his Colt revolver as he approached the wagon, boots crunching on the dry grass. The crying from inside had stopped, replaced by a tense silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Hello," Preston called, keeping his voice steady despite his apprehension. "Anyone in there?" No response came, but he could hear movement inside someone shifting position, perhaps pressing themselves against the far side of the wagon. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he continued, moving closer. "Those men are gone now." Preston circled the wagon and discovered something that made his blood boil, a heavy padlock securing the back door. Someone was locked inside, like cargo, or worse. "I'm gonna get you out of there," he promised, examining the lock. It was solid iron, impossible to break without the right tools. He glanced toward the horizon where the men had disappeared, wondering if they'd return soon. With determination setting his jaw, Preston retrieved a small pry bar from his saddlebag. His horse, a sturdy palomino named Copper, watched with calm interest as he worked the metal into the wagon's wooden frame. "Stand back if you can," he warned whoever was inside. With a powerful heave, he snapped the wood around the lock. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a dark interior. Huddled in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, was a young woman. Her wedding dress, once white and pristine, was now soiled and torn. Her eyes, wide with fear and rimmed red from crying, met his. Despite the dirt smudged across her face, Preston could see she was beautiful, with delicate features and honey-brown hair that had escaped from an elaborate updo. "Madam," Preston said softly, removing his hat. "Are you hurt?" The woman stared at him, suspicious and frightened. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from crying. "Name's Preston Finch. I'm just passing through these parts." He kept his distance, not wanting to frighten her further. "I heard a commotion and saw those men riding away." "They left me to die," she said, a flash of anger breaking through her fear. "My own wedding party." Preston extended his hand slowly. "I don't know what happened, madam, but nobody deserves to be locked up like this. Let me help you down from there." After a moment's hesitation, she reached out and placed her trembling hand in his. As she stepped into the sunlight, Preston saw bruising on her wrists and a small cut on her cheek. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Josephine," she replied, withdrawing her hand and straightening her shoulders with newfound resolve. "Josephine Sutton. Though I suppose I'm not Mrs. Blackburn after all, am I?" Preston glanced around nervously. "Those men could come back. We should get moving. I've got a camp set up about 2 miles east of here. We can figure things out there." Josephine nodded, then suddenly swayed on her feet. Preston caught her before she fell. "When's the last time you had water or food?" he asked, concern deepening his voice. "I don't know," she admitted weakly. "Yesterday morning? Perhaps." Without hesitation, Preston lifted her onto Copper's back before mounting behind her. "Hold on tight, Miss Sutton. I'm taking you somewhere safe." As they rode away from the abandoned wagon, Josephine's body relaxed slightly against him. Preston kept his eyes scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of the men returning, but his mind was filled with questions about the woman in the tattered wedding dress and what could possibly have led to her shameful abandonment in the wilderness. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they arrived at Preston's modest camp by a small creek. A simple canvas tent, a fire ring, and his supplies were all he had. But it was secure and hidden from the main trail. "It's not much," he apologized as he helped Josephine down from copper. "But you'll be safe here." She looked around with tired eyes. "It's more than I had an hour ago, Mr. Finch." Preston busied himself with rekindling the fire and preparing a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. Josephine sat on a fallen log, the white fabric of her dress stark against the wilderness backdrop. "You should drink," he said, offering her his canteen. She accepted it gratefully, taking careful sips at first, then drinking deeply as her thirst overtook her. "Thank you," she said, returning the canteen. "For everything." Preston nodded, giving her space as he tended to the fire. "When you're feeling up to it, I'd like to know what happened. Seems mighty strange to find a bride locked in a wagon in the middle of nowhere." Josephine stared into the growing flames. "It's a long story, Mr. Finch." "Preston," he corrected gently. "And we've got time." She took a deep breath. "I was to be married today to Edward Blackburn, son of Thomas Blackburn, who owns half the cattle in the territory. It was arranged by my father, a business arrangement more than a marriage. The Blackburns needed respectability. My father needed money." Preston handed her a tin plate of food, which she accepted with a small nod of thanks. "Everything was fine until last night," she continued after taking a few bites. "I overheard Edward talking with his friends. He was boasting about how he'd been with my sister Julia last spring when she visited our ranch." Preston's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I confronted him, of course. He denied it at first, then laughed like it was nothing of consequence." Josephine's voice hardened. "I told him the wedding was off, that I would tell everyone what kind of man he really was. That's when he grabbed me." She rubbed her bruised wrists unconsciously. "His father came in during our struggle. Instead of helping me, he helped Edward tie me up. They said I was hysterical, that no one would believe me anyway. They locked me in a storage room overnight. And this morning, they put me in that wagon. I heard them talking about leaving me at an abandoned mining camp. They said I would be found eventually, if I was lucky." Preston's hand clenched around his coffee cup. "That's not just wrong, Miss Sutton. That's criminal. Please, call me Josephine," she said quietly. "And it wouldn't matter. The Blackburns practically own the law in these parts." As darkness fell completely, Preston offered Josephine his tent. "You should rest. I'll keep watch and sleep by the fire." She hesitated. "I've imposed enough." "It's no imposition," he insisted. "You've been through hell today. Get some sleep. Things might look clearer in the morning." Josephine disappeared into the tent, while Preston settled himself by the fire, his rifle across his lap. The night sounds of the wilderness surrounded them, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, the gentle bubbling of the creek. Under different circumstances, it might have been peaceful. Preston's mind worked overtime. The Blackburns were indeed powerful in this territory. If they were looking for Josephine, they wouldn't be looking kindly. And if they found her with him, well, that would go poorly for both of them. "We need to keep moving," he muttered to himself. "Head further west, maybe." He had been drifting for years, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand or guide, never staying in one place too long. He hadn't planned on company, especially not a woman running from one of the most powerful families in the territory. But something about Josephine Sutton's quiet dignity in the face of such betrayal moved him. Morning came with a golden glow that painted the landscape in warm hues. Preston was already up, having slept fitfully through the night, when Josephine emerged from the tent. She had tried to clean herself up, her hair now loosely braided and her face washed, but the wedding dress remained a stark reminder of her ordeal. "Morning," Preston greeted, offering her a cup of fresh coffee. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I expected," she admitted, accepting the cup. "What happens now, Preston?" He had been pondering that very question all night. "I think we need to get you somewhere safe, away from Blackburn territory. I was heading to Silver Creek. It's a small settlement about 4 days' ride from here. I know some decent folks there who might help." "And then what?" Josephine asked, her eyes meeting his directly. "I have nowhere to go. My father made it clear that if I didn't marry Edward, I would no longer be welcome in his home." Preston frowned. "That's mighty harsh." "That's business," she replied with a bitter smile. "The Suttons and sentiment don't mix well." "Well, we'll figure something out," Preston promised. "First things first, We need to get you some proper traveling clothes. That dress is beautiful and all, but it's ruined anyway, Josephine said, looking down at the once pristine fabric. And I'll be glad to be rid of it. Preston rummaged through his pack and pulled out a spare shirt and trousers. These'll be too big, but they'll do until we can get you something proper. Josephine took the offered clothes with a grateful nod. Thank you for everything. While she changed in the tent, Preston broke down camp and packed their meager supplies onto Copper. The horse seemed to sense the urgency, standing patiently as Preston secured their belongings. When Josephine emerged, Preston couldn't help but smile. His clothes swallowed her slender frame. The shirt sleeves rolled up multiple times and the trousers cinched tight with rope, but she looked more comfortable already. She had bundled her wedding dress and carried it under her arm. What do you want to do with that? Preston asked, nodding toward the dress. Josephine looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the fire pit where the embers still glowed. The delicate fabric caught quickly, flames consuming the evidence of her shame and betrayal. Let's go, she said simply. They rode double on Copper, making slower progress than Preston would have liked, but the horse was strong and seemed to understand the importance of their journey. Josephine sat in front of Preston, her back straight despite her exhaustion. They kept off the main trails, sticking to the cover of trees when possible. As they rode, Preston told Josephine about himself, how he'd left Missouri after his parents died, how he'd worked his way west taking whatever honest work he could find, how he'd learned to live with the solitude of the trail. Don't you get lonely? Josephine asked over her shoulder. Preston considered this. Sometimes, but I've met good people along the way, made some friends, even if I don't see them often. What about you, before all this happened? Josephine was quiet for a moment. I was raised to be a proper lady. That meant a lot of time with tutors and very little time making friends. Julia was my only real companion, and even she. Well, you know. I'm sorry, Preston said sincerely. Family should stand by you. I think perhaps I never really had a family, she replied softly. Not the way you mean it? They made camp as the sun began to set. Finding a sheltered spot between two large boulders that offered some protection from the wind that had picked up, Preston hunted a rabbit for their dinner, and Josephine surprised him by expertly skinning and preparing it for cooking. My father may have wanted a proper lady, she explained, seeing his expression, but our cook believed everyone should know how to feed themselves. As they ate by the fire, Josephine asked, Tell me about Silver Creek. What kind of place is it? Preston smiled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. It's small but growing, good people mostly. There's a woman there, Mrs. Henderson, who runs a boarding house. She's fair and doesn't ask too many questions. I thought maybe you could stay with her while you figure things out. And you? Josephine asked, meeting his eyes across the flames. Will you stay too? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Preston had never planned to stay anywhere for long. But now, looking at Josephine in the firelight, he found himself reconsidering. I might stick around for a spell, he said carefully. Make sure you're settled in proper. Josephine nodded, a small smile touching her lips. I'd like that. That night, as they lay on opposite sides of the fire, Preston found himself unable to sleep. He watched the stars overhead, bright and countless in the clear night sky, and thought about how quickly life could change. Just yesterday, he had been a lone drifter with no particular destination in mind. Now, he was responsible for someone else's safety, someone who was beginning to occupy his thoughts in ways he hadn't expected. The next morning brought dark clouds and the promise of rain. They packed quickly and set out, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before the storm hit. Josephine was quiet, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Something on your mind? Preston asked after they'd been riding for an hour. I was just thinking about the Blackburns, she admitted. They're not the type to let things go. If they realize I'm alive and might talk, they'll come looking. Preston's grip on the reins tightened. Let them try. I won't let anyone hurt you, Josephine. She turned slightly to look at him, her expression softening. You barely know me, Preston. Why risk yourself for my sake? It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself. I suppose I know what it's like to be alone against the world, and I know what's right. Leaving you in that wagon, what they did to you that wasn't right. Sometimes that's all the reason a man needs. The first raindrops began to fall, large and heavy, pattering against the ground around them. Preston urged Copper forward, looking for shelter from the impending downpour. They found an abandoned line shack tucked against a hillside, its roof mostly intact despite its weathered appearance. Preston helped Josephine dismount and led Copper to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack. Inside, the single room was dusty but dry. A small stone fireplace stood against one wall, and a crude wooden platform that might have once been a bed frame occupied another corner. "It's not much," Preston said apologetically, "but it'll keep us dry." "It's perfect," Josephine replied, rubbing her arms against the chill that had set in with the rain. Preston set about gathering what scraps of dry wood he could find to start a fire. The rain increased in intensity, drumming against the roof and creating a steady white noise that was oddly comforting. As warmth began to fill the small space, Josephine sat close to the flames, her face illuminated by their dancing light. Preston found himself watching her, struck by her resilience. "You're staring," she said without looking up. Preston felt heat rise to his cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Sorry, I was just thinking you're handling all this remarkably well. Most people would be falling apart after what you've been through." Josephine turned to meet his gaze. "Perhaps I haven't had the luxury of falling apart yet." Her voice was steady. But Preston could see the emotion swimming in her eyes. Without thinking, he moved to sit beside her and placed his hand gently over hers. "It's all right if you do, you know. Fall apart, I mean. I won't think any less of you for it." The simple touch and honest words seemed to break something open inside her. Tears filled Josephine's eyes and spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. "I was such a fool," she whispered. "I knew the marriage was for convenience, not love, but I thought at least there would be respect, honor. I never imagined—" Preston squeezed her hand gently. "You weren't a fool, Josephine. They were wrong, not you." She leaned against his shoulder, her tears coming more freely now. Preston hesitantly put his arm around her, providing comfort in the only way he knew how, with his presence and his silence. They stayed that way as the storm raged outside, the line between comforting a person in distress and holding someone dear becoming increasingly blurred in Preston's mind. When Josephine finally pulled away, wiping her eyes, the absence of her warmth against him was palpable. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening, for being here." Preston nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Something was changing between them, something neither of them had anticipated. As night fell, the rain continued unabated. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from Preston's supplies, sitting close to the fire for warmth. "Tell me more about yourself," Josephine requested. "What were you doing before you found me?" Preston leaned back against his saddle, which he'd brought in to use as a pillow. "I was heading west to try my luck in the gold fields. Not that I expect to strike it rich, mind you. Just thought I might find steady work in one of the mining towns." "You don't strike me as a miner," Josephine observed. Preston chuckled. "No? What do I strike you as, then?" She studied him thoughtfully. "A protector, someone who looks out for others, the way you looked out for me." Her assessment touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. "Well, I don't know about that. I was just in the right place at the right time. Or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it," Josephine countered with a small smile. "You could be halfway to California by now if you hadn't stopped to help me." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Preston said firmly, surprising himself with his certainty. Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment, the rain and the wilderness and their uncertain future all faded away. There was only this connection, unexpected and powerful. The moment was broken by a particularly loud crack of thunder that made Josephine jump. Preston cleared his throat and stood, moving to check that Copper was secure in the lean-to. When he returned, Josephine had arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. The practical reminder of their situation, virtual strangers thrown together by circumstance, cooled the warmth that had been building in Preston's chest. "We should try to get some sleep," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "We've still got a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." Josephine nodded, slipping into her bedroll fully clothed. "Good night, Preston, and thank you again." "Good night, Josephine," he replied, settling onto his own bedroll. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Preston. He lay awake listening to the rain, acutely aware of Josephine's presence across the fire. He had spent years avoiding attachments, moving on whenever things threatened to become complicated. Yet here he was, already deeply invested in the welfare of a woman he'd known for barely 2 days. The rain stopped sometime in the early hours of the morning, and Preston finally drifted off to a fitful sleep filled with dreams of Josephine in her tattered wedding dress, always just out of reach. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Josephine stoking the fire. Sunlight streamed through the single window of the line shack, indicating they had slept later than planned. "I found coffee in your supplies," Josephine explained. "I hope you don't mind that I started it." Preston sat up, rubbing his face. "Not at all. You're an early riser." "Old habits," she said with a shrug. "My father believed idle hands were the devil's workshop." Preston accepted a cup of coffee from her, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. "We should reach Silver Creek by tomorrow evening if the weather holds and we make good time." Josephine nodded, her expression unreadable. "And then what?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibilities neither dared to voice. Preston sipped his coffee, buying time to gather his thoughts. "Then you'll be safe," he finally said. "Mrs. Henderson will take good care of you. She might even know of some work you could do if you're of a mind to stay in Silver Creek." "And you?" Josephine asked. The same question from before, but weighted differently now. Preston met her eyes steadily. "I meant what I said. I'll stay until I know you're settled and safe." Josephine looked like she wanted to say more, but instead nodded and turned to pack up their few belongings. The easy intimacy of the previous evening had been replaced by a careful politeness that felt both necessary and frustrating. They rode out under clear skies, the land freshly washed by the rain and vibrant with life. Copper seemed energized by the cooler air, moving at a brisker pace than the previous days. They kept to less traveled routes, Preston constantly vigilant for any sign of pursuit. By midday they had covered significant ground. They stopped in a small clearing to rest Copper and eat a quick meal. Josephine had been quiet most of the morning, lost in her own thoughts. "Penny for your thoughts," Preston said as they sat in the dappled shade of a cottonwood tree. Josephine looked up, a wry smile on her lips. "I doubt they're worth even that much. I was just wondering what my life might have been like if I'd had the courage to refuse the engagement from the beginning." "Takes a different kind of courage to walk away from the life you've always known," Preston observed. "Most folks never manage it." "Is that what you did?" she asked. "Walk away from the life you knew?" Preston nodded slowly. "After my parents died, there wasn't much holding me to Missouri. My older brother took over the farm. He offered me a place, but it wasn't what you wanted," Josephine finished for him. "No," Preston admitted. "I always felt there was something more out there for me. Something I needed to find." "And have you found it?" Her question was soft, almost tentative. Preston looked at her, really looked at her the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the quiet strength in her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips. "I'm beginning to think I might have." A flush spread across Josephine's cheeks, and she looked down at her hands. "We should keep moving," she said after a moment, but her voice held a warmth that hadn't been there before. They continued their journey, the silence between them now comfortable rather than strained. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change subtly, the open plains giving way to more varied terrain, with rocky outcroppings and scattered stands of pine. "We're getting close to Silver Creek territory," Preston explained, as they paused atop a rise that offered a view of the land ahead. "See those mountains to the northwest? Silver Creek sits in the foothills just beyond that ridge." Josephine shaded her eyes, taking in the vista. "It's beautiful country." "That it is," Preston agreed. "Different from what you're used to?" "Very," she said. "Our ranch was all open grassland, good for cattle, but not as wild as this." Preston was about to respond when he noticed a cloud of dust in the distance behind them. He tensed, his hand automatically going to his rifle. "What is it?" Josephine asked, sensing his change in demeanor. "Riders," Preston said grimly. "Could be nothing, but we shouldn't take chances. Come on." They urged Copper down the far side of the rise, picking up their pace. Preston led them toward a denser stand of trees, hoping to use the cover to their advantage. "Do you think it's them?" Josephine asked, her voice tight with fear. Can't say for certain, Preston replied honestly. But better safe than sorry. They pushed on through the afternoon, taking a more circuitous route than Preston had originally planned. The riders behind them remained distant but persistent, appearing occasionally on the horizon when Preston checked their back trail. As dusk approached, Preston made a decision. We need to keep moving through the night. Silver Creek is still a good day's ride at our normal pace, but if we push on, we might reach it by morning. Josephine nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. Copper can handle it. He's the strongest horse I've ever known, Preston assured her, patting the Palomino's neck affectionately. He won't let us down. They rode through the gathering darkness, the moon providing just enough light to navigate safely. Preston kept them moving steadily, his senses heightened for any sound of pursuit. Josephine remained alert despite her obvious fatigue, her body tense against his. Hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the sound of Copper's hooves and the occasional night creature calling in the distance. The riders behind them seemed to have disappeared, but Preston didn't trust that they had given up so easily. Well after midnight, they reached a small stream where Preston allowed them a brief rest. Copper drank deeply while Preston refilled their canteens. "You should try to sleep," he told Josephine. "I'll wake you when we need to move on." She shook her head, stubborn despite her exhaustion. "I'm fine. We should keep going." Preston admired her tenacity even as he worried about her. "Just a short rest then, for Copper's sake, if not your own." Josephine relented, settling against a tree trunk while Preston kept watch. The night was clear and cold, stars spilling across the sky in brilliant profusion. Despite the danger at their backs, Preston found himself struck by the beauty of the moment and by the woman beside him who had shown more courage in the past few days than most men he'd known in a lifetime. After an hour's rest, they continued on. The terrain became more challenging as they entered the foothills, forcing them to slow their pace. Dawn found them navigating a narrow trail that wound through pine-covered slopes. "We're close now," Preston assured Josephine, whose eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Another few hours at most." She nodded, leaning back against him more heavily than before. Preston's arms tightened around her, both to steady her and to offer what comfort he could. The sun was climbing toward its midday height when they finally crested a ridge and saw Silver Creek spread out below them. The settlement was larger than Preston remembered, with new buildings dotting the main street and smoke rising from multiple chimneys. "There it is," he said, relief evident in his voice. "We made it." Josephine straightened, taking in the view. "It looks peaceful." "It is, mostly," Preston replied. "Good folk trying to make their way. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is the blue building just off the main street there." They descended the trail toward town, Copper moving more eagerly now, as if he sensed their journey was nearly complete. Preston kept his eyes open for any sign of the riders who had been following them, but the trail behind them remained clear. As they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Preston felt a curious mixture of relief and regret. They had reached safety, which was what mattered most. But their arrival also marked the potential end of his time with Josephine, a prospect that troubled him more than he cared to admit. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was neat and well-maintained, with curtains in the windows and flower boxes on the porch. Preston helped Josephine dismount, both of them stiff from the long ride. "Let me do the talking," Preston suggested as they approached the front door. "Mrs. Henderson can be particular about her guests, but she's a good woman at heart." The door opened before they could knock, revealing a stout woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. Her shrewd eyes took in their trail-worn appearance with a single glance. "Preston Finch," she said, her voice carrying a hint of the South. "Been a while since you darkened my door." "Mrs. Henderson," Preston greeted, removing his hat. "You're looking well?" The older woman snorted. "Save your sweet talk for someone who'll believe it. Who's your friend?" "This is Miss Josephine Sutton," Preston introduced. "She's in need of a safe place to stay for a while. I was hoping you might have a room available." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed as she assessed Josephine more carefully. "Trouble following you, girl?" Josephine met the woman's gaze steadily. "Yes, madam, but not of my making." Something in her honest answer seemed to satisfy Mrs. Henderson. "Well, come on in then. You look like you haven't slept in days, or bathed for that matter." Relief washed over Preston as they followed Mrs. Henderson into the house. The interior was immaculate, with polished floors and simple but tasteful furnishings. "I've got one room available upstairs," Mrs. Henderson informed them. "It's small, but it's clean and has its own wash basin. As for you, Preston, I expect you'll be wanting your usual room in the back." Preston hesitated, glancing at Josephine. "I, haven't quite decided how long I'll be staying." Mrs. Henderson looked between them, a knowing expression crossing her face. "Well, the room's there if you want it. Now, Miss Sutton, let me show you upstairs. I expect you'll be wanting a hot bath and a proper meal." As Mrs. Henderson led Josephine toward the stairs, the younger woman glanced back at Preston. "Will you be here when I come down?" she asked, a vulnerability in her voice that tugged at his heart. "I'll be here," he promised. "Get some rest. We can talk later." With a small nod, Josephine followed Mrs. Henderson upstairs, leaving Preston alone in the entryway. He exhaled slowly, the full weight of the past few days finally settling on him now that they had reached relative safety. He needed to see to Copper, find out if anyone had been asking about strangers in town, and figure out their next move. Because despite reaching Silver Creek, Preston knew their troubles were far from over. The Blackburns weren't the type to give up easily, especially if they believed Josephine might talk about what they had done. And then there was the matter of his own growing feelings for Josephine, feelings that complicated an already complex situation. Preston had spent years avoiding entanglements, but somehow in the span of just a few days, Josephine Sutton had become more important to him than he would have thought possible. Later, after seeing to Copper's needs at the local livery and making discreet inquiries around town, Preston returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson intercepted him in the hallway, her expression serious. "That girl's been through something terrible," she said without preamble. "She wouldn't say much, but I've been around long enough to recognize the signs. What are you mixed up in, Preston?" Preston sighed, knowing he owed Mrs. Henderson at least some of the truth. She was meant to marry into the Blackburn family. When she discovered the kind of men they really were, they tried to dispose of her. I happened to find her before they succeeded. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. "The Blackburns? Lord have mercy, boy. You've stepped in at this time. Those men have reach, even this far west." "I know," Preston acknowledged grimly. "That's why I brought her here. I need time to figure out what to do next." The older woman studied him for a moment. "You care for her," she observed. It wasn't a question. Preston didn't deny it. "She's brave and decent, Mrs. Henderson. She deserves better than what life's handed her so far." A rare smile softened the older woman's features. "Well, she'll be safe here for now. I've got a shotgun, and I'm not afraid to use it if anyone comes asking questions they shouldn't." "Thank you," Preston said sincerely. "Is she—" "Sleeping," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Poor thing was dead on her feet. I've left word to be woken when she comes down." Preston nodded, relieved that Josephine was finally getting the rest she desperately needed. "I'll be back later then. There are a few more things I need to take care of in town." As Preston turned to leave, Mrs. Henderson called after him. "Be careful, Preston. Whatever's between you two, it's clear as day to anyone with eyes. That kind of feeling can make a man reckless." Preston acknowledged her warning with a nod before stepping back out into the afternoon sunlight, her words echoing in his mind as he made his way toward the telegraph office. Feelings aside, he needed to ensure Josephine's safety, and that meant gathering information and potentially calling in some favors from old friends. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Josephine remained at the boarding house, gradually regaining her strength and spirits. Mrs. Henderson, having taken a liking to the young woman, introduced her to several townspeople as her niece from back east, a fiction that provided Josephine with a measure of protection and anonymity. Preston split his time between keeping watch for any sign of the Blackburns and spending increasingly comfortable hours in Josephine's company. They would sit on the boarding house's back porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their hopes, the books they'd read, the places they'd seen or wanted to see. With each passing day, Preston found himself more drawn to her quiet strength, her quick mind, and the gentle humor that emerged as she began to feel secure. And though neither of them spoke of it directly, he sensed that Josephine felt the same connection growing between them. A week after their arrival in Silver Creek, Preston received a reply to the telegraph he'd sent to an old friend who worked as a marshal in Helena. The news was both concerning and potentially useful. Edward Blackburn and his father had reported Josephine missing, claiming she had run away before the wedding, possibly with a disreputable drifter who had been seen in the area. They were offering a substantial reward for information leading to her return. The one piece of good news was that they hadn't explicitly accused Preston of any crime. It seemed they weren't certain who had helped Josephine escape, which gave them a small advantage. That evening, Preston shared the information with Josephine as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. "So they're looking for me," she said quietly after he finished. "I expected as much." Preston nodded grimly. "They're being careful about it, though, making it sound like you're the one in the wrong, needing to be returned to your rightful place." Josephine's hands tightened in her lap. "What does this mean for us, Preston? For our plans?" The word "our" caught his attention, warming something deep inside him. "It means we need to be more cautious, and it might mean we need to consider moving on from Silver Creek sooner than I'd hoped." "Where would we go?" she asked, looking up at him with those clear eyes that seemed to see right through him. Preston had been considering this very question for days. "I have a friend who owns a small ranch near the Montana-Idaho border. Remote enough to be safe, but not so isolated that we couldn't make a life there." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. A life there. Together. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. "You've thought about this," she finally said. "About us." Preston met her gaze steadily. "I have, more than I probably should, given that we've known each other such a short time." "Time isn't always the best measure of such things," Josephine replied softly. "Sometimes a few days can teach you more about a person than years of polite conversation." Preston reached out slowly and took her hand in his. "Josephine, I know this isn't how either of us imagined things would go. You were meant to marry a wealthy rancher's son, and I was meant to keep drifting. But finding you in that wagon, helping you these past days, it's changed something in me. Something I didn't know needed changing." Josephine's fingers tightened around his. "It's changed me too, Preston. When you broke that lock and helped me out of that wagon, you didn't just rescue me from the Blackburns. You showed me what real honor looks like, what true kindness is." Preston's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at their joined hands. "I can't offer you the kind of life you were raised to expect. I don't have wealth or position, but I can promise to protect you, to respect you, and to build something good alongside you, if you'll have me." Josephine's free hand came up to touch his face gently. "I was raised to expect a loveless marriage of convenience, Preston. What you're offering is worth far more than all the Blackburn cattle combined." The air between them seemed to still as Preston leaned forward, drawn by a force he couldn't have resisted if he tried. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened with a surety that belied their short acquaintance. Josephine's hand moved to the back of his neck, holding him close as the last light of day faded around them. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "We should leave soon," he murmured. "Tomorrow, if possible." Josephine nodded, her eyes still closed. "I know. But tonight, can we just have this moment? Before we have to run again?" Preston's answer was to pull her closer, wrapping his arms around her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever pursuit might come, he knew with absolute certainty that finding Josephine had been no accident. Some things, perhaps, were simply meant to be. They left Silver Creek at dawn the following day, having bid a grateful farewell to Mrs. Henderson, who pressed a bundle of food and a small pistol into Josephine's hands before they departed. "A woman should be able to protect herself," the older woman had declared firmly. "Preston's a good man, but even good men can't be everywhere at once." Now, as they rode westward toward the distant mountains, Josephine seated comfortably on the mare Mrs. Henderson had helped them purchase. Preston felt a curious sense of homecoming despite heading into unfamiliar territory. They weren't just running from something anymore. They were running towards something. A future. Together. 3 weeks later, they stood hand in hand before a small gathering of friends on the porch of the remote ranch that would become their home. Preston's friend James, a circuit-riding preacher, performed a simple ceremony that bound them together as husband and wife. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue calico, her hair adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning. Preston had traded his trail-worn clothes for the cleanest shirt and vest he owned, his hat conspicuously absent as he spoke his vows in a voice that carried across the valley. "I take you, Josephine Sutton, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he promised, his eyes never leaving hers. "To protect and cherish, to stand beside through whatever storms may come, from this day until my last." Josephine's voice was clear and steady as she replied, "I take you, Preston Finch, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to honor and support, to build a life of purpose and joy alongside you, from this day until my last." As the small group of witnesses, mostly neighboring ranchers and their families, cheered the union, Preston pulled his new wife close and sealed their vows with a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Later, as the guests departed and they stood alone on the porch of the small cabin they would call home, Josephine leaned against Preston's side. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, still sometimes finding it hard to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. Josephine looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied without hesitation. "And you?" Preston's answer was to sweep her into his arms and carry her across the threshold of their home, both of them laughing as he kicked the door closed behind them. The Blackburns never found them. Whether they eventually gave up the search or simply failed to look far enough west, the threat they had posed gradually faded into the background of Preston and Josephine's new life. They built their ranch slowly but surely, adding a few cattle each year, planting an orchard that Josephine tended with care, eventually building a larger house as their family grew. 5 years after Preston had broken the lock on that abandoned wagon and found the woman who would change his life forever, they stood together watching their young son chase fireflies in the twilight, their infant daughter sleeping peacefully in Josephine's arms. "I was thinking about the first time I saw you today," Preston said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "How scared you looked, how angry." Josephine smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I remember thinking you were either my salvation or another nightmare. I'm glad it was the former." Preston pressed a kiss to her temple. "We've come a long way from that day." "We have," she agreed. "But I wouldn't change how we started, Preston. Not one moment of it, even the fear and the running, because it all led us here." As darkness settled fully over their land, they called their son inside and put both children to bed. Later, lying together in the quiet of their room, Preston held Josephine close and marveled at how a single decision to investigate a sound from an abandoned wagon had altered the course of his life so completely. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "More today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow." Josephine's answer was to kiss him, with all the passion and tenderness that had only deepened with the passing years, a silent promise that whatever the future might hold, they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful day together.